Okay, are you ready for part 3 of the Twits? Here we go. Mrs. Twit gets the stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the string to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her wrists, some under her arms, and even some in her hair. Soon there were about 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. There she is, look. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her mouth and said something very silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" said Mr. Twit. What a terrible thought. We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no. "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to make sure I'm absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a devilish look on his lips, he knelt down by her feet. He took out a penknife from his pocket and quickly cut through the strings, holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old witch is lost and gone forever." It's not very nice, is it? Now, Mrs. Twit may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up in the sky she had a bright idea. "I need to get rid of some of these balloons. I will stop going up and then I will start coming down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climbing slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether and stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float down. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. So now she began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's skirt billowed out like a parachute, showing her knickers. It was a beautiful sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary young woman in the sky. Now, Mr. Twit, who thought he'd seen the last of his wife for quite a long time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a drink. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house, above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old frumpet." Mr. Twit jumped, as though he'd been stung. He dropped his drink. He looked up and gasped. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Oh, oh," he said. "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she somehow managed to hang on to all this time. "I'll swish you into a swazzle," she said. "I'll swash you into a swizzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and skirts and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with her stick and cracking him all over his body. But that is enough of that. We can't go on forever watching these two people doing these tricks to each other. We must go ahead with our story. So here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Doesn't really look like a house. Looks more like a prison. It hasn't got any windows anywhere. Who wants windows, Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. Who wants everybody looking in to see what you're doing? It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. And what do you think of the ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. I always grow plenty of spiky things. They keep out nosy, nasty little children. Near the house you can see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side there is a big tree. It hasn't got any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree you can see is a monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit, and you'll hear about them later. Once a week on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Oh dear. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before bird pie day, he would put the ladder up against the dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug Tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, birds would fly in from all around to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible glue. The moment they landed on the branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was bird pie day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder and see which birds were there. Now, one Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hug Tight, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the stinging nettles and the thistles, not when there were monkeys to look at. After a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden and found the ladder leaning against the big dead tree. They decided to climb it, just for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. The next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the trousers. There were no birds because the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. "As there are no birds for my pie tonight," he shouted, "I'll have to have little boy pie instead." He started to climb the ladder. "Boy pie might be better than bird pie," he said. "More meat and not so many tiny little bones." The boys were terrified. "He's going to boil us up," said one of them. "Oh my goodness, he's going to cook us with carrots," said another. But the 4th little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, "Listen, I've just had an idea. We're only stuck by our trousers, so quick, unbutton your trousers and slip out of them and fall to the ground." Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to make a grab for the nearest boy when they all of a sudden tumbled out of the tree and ran for their homes in just their pants. Now for the monkeys. The 4 monkeys in the cage in the garden were all one family. There were Mugglewump and his wife and their 2 small children. But what on earth were Mr. and Mrs. Twit doing with monkeys in their garden? Well, in the old days they had both worked in a circus as monkey trainers. They used to teach monkeys to do tricks and to dress up in clothes and do all sorts of things. Today, although they were tired, Mr. Twit still wanted to train monkeys. It was his dream that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world. That meant that the monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down, on their hands with their feet in the air. They had to play football upside down. They had to balance on top of one another upside down, with Mugglewump at the bottom and the smallest baby monkey at the very top. They even had to eat and drink upside down. And that is not an easy thing to do, because the food and water has to go up your throat instead of down it. In fact, it is almost impossible. but the monkeys simply had to do it, otherwise they got nothing. All this sounds pretty silly to you and me. It sounded pretty silly to the monkeys too. They absolutely hated having to do this upside-down nonsense day after day. It made them dizzy standing on their heads for hours on end. Sometimes the two small monkey children would faint with so much blood going to their heads. But Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept them practicing for 6 hours every day, and if they didn't do as they were told, Mrs. Twit would scare them. It's not very kind, is it? I'm glad we haven't got a Mr. or Mrs. Twits near us. Ready for the next instalment tomorrow. Bye.